Well, welcome everyone. So my name is Christiane Whitehouse, and you're calling into a Dragonfly public talk. And this talk is called Managing Upwards. So optimizing student-supervisor communication to support well-being. And I think we have a mix of people here today, people who are Dragonfly ambassadors, so welcome to this session, and also hopefully some graduate students who are here to learn about managing upwards. So we'll see. On that note, I will get started. Just a bit of an introduction of me. Oh, and I should, okay. Let me know if you can't see my slide, but it should be all right. So just a bit of an introduction about me. Like I said, my name is Christiane, she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the lead designers for today's workshop. So it's been a really fun collaboration between myself and Dragonfly Mental Health. I just completed my PhD in clinical psych last month. So being a graduate student is very, very fresh in my mind. And I'll be starting as a, oh, I see a clapping hands. Thank you very much. But so I'll be starting as a psychologist this October here in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. And my specialty, or one of my specialties, is neuropsychology. So looking at cognitive functioning, but also the other piece is kind of treating the mental health side of living with chronic physical health conditions. And so kind of similarly, I'm interested in the mental health side of being a graduate student and being in academia. And I have been an advocate for grad student mental health in academia throughout my PhD, which is kind of what landed me here, collaborating with Dragonfly. So excited to be here. For anyone who doesn't know already, I know we have lots of Dragonfly alumni. Dragonfly is a nonprofit organization. It was founded in 2019 by Wendy Ingram and Jelena Bresnik. And this organization does many things, but there's kind of three main domains of activity. So there's a large group of volunteers, largely academics, that are working together to conduct research and address systemic issues within academia. And that's the Global Consortium for Academic Mental Health. We have Dragonfly Cafe, which is also a worldwide community of academics that care about mental health, both their own and their colleagues. And there's frequent sessions of kind of peer support and networking. And then the on-campus programs. So developing, deploying, delivering these programs. And this includes our workshops like today, educational talks, anti-stigma campaigns, and all of these kind of aim to create a culture and climate changes directly in academia. But you can read more about Dragonfly and what they do on their website, dragonflymentalhealth.com. That's there at the bottom. Certainly encourage you to do so. All right. But so Dragonfly's approach to kind of cultivating this excellent mental health is multifaceted. So helping develop department committees, there's peer networks, putting on skills workshops, mental health literacy, anti-stigma campaigns. And the approach of each of these is kind of developed for the community that Dragonfly is working with. So the goal of today's workshop is to provide practical strategies for students to manage their supervisory relationships in support of their mental health and wellness. So hopefully a great goal. We do have structured points for polls, for discussion, that you can either choose to jump in with or just listen. And we are going to do putting some of the skills to work, some practice near the end. And so my hope is that you leave here today feeling ready to immediately implement what we've discussed in your student-supervisor relationship. That being said, before we go, I'm going to launch a poll. So I'd love everyone to take a second and just before we get started, reply to these questions. We just want to get a sense of where everyone's at. All right. Great. Okay. So I'm going to stop here. Thanks, everyone. So we can see, do you feel like your student-supervisor relationship could be improved to support your well-being? And we definitely have a high group of people saying yes in some way, and that's great. That's probably why you're here today. You've come to the right place. Are you aware of skills and approaches? And we have a lot of somewhat. Great. So you might be able to tell us what you know, and we'll tell you what we know today. And how confident are you at implementing these skills? And a big mix here. We got maybe a bell curve a little bit, with somewhat confident, neutral kind of being the more common responses. Awesome. So let's get started. Introduction to managing upwards. All right. So before we can jump into managing upwards, we got to start with the big topic, mental health in academia. So I like to reference in 2018, Nature Biotechnology published an article listed here titled Evidence for a Mental Health Crisis in Graduate Education. And this article really highlighted that graduate students were 6 times more likely to experience depression and anxiety than the general population. And they wrote that there's a call for cultural change. And so although, and we've got to start off by saying, this cultural change needs to be bigger than just the students. They need to have support from people in positions of power, the faculty, universities, scientific societies. But in the meantime, there are still meaningful steps that graduate students can take to support their mental health and overall wellness. And so the researchers in this article identified 2 phenomena relevant to our workshop today. So the first is that of the over 2,000 graduate students that replied to their survey, those who agreed with the statement, "I have good work-life balance," were significantly less likely to experience depression and anxiety. So first. And second, the student-supervisor relationship also seemed to play a role. So students who did not think their supervisor provided real mentorship, made them feel valued, or provided ample support, those students reported significantly higher rates of depression and anxiety. But so for comparison here, the global prevalence of depression and anxiety published by the World Health Organization is around 4%. So this article certainly isn't suggesting that work-life balance makes everything perfect. No, but it seems that having good work-life balance and this positive supervisory relationship can have an impact on those high rates of depression and anxiety. So that's good for us. But so I've got a poll for you. Have you ever felt depressed and or anxious at some point during your graduate training? We know that that this is actually the norm. Everyone on here said yes. And depression and anxiety are something that makes us feel very alone. That's part of the illness. There's not necessarily physical illnesses that have the same effect. But depression, it makes us feel alone. And I think it's useful to even just know that your peers are likely going through the same thing or have gone through the same thing at some point, even if it was just a moment during their training. So something to keep in mind as we go forward. All right. But so let's jump into it, managing upwards. So this refers to creating a good and productive working relationship with your boss to your mutual benefit. And this term is much more common in business, and it's used when discussing how to be a better employee. But I use this term to describe strategies for graduate students in academia. So managing upwards is a skill that graduate students can apply in their relationship with their supervisor in order to support their mental health while maintaining a good supervisory relationship, because that's key as well. But there are a couple of points that I'd like to highlight about the student-supervisor relationship. So the first is that supervisors want their students to succeed. And this, people have argued with me on this point, but I think that can indicate, a particularly rough relationship, and that does happen. But I want you to think about the fact that supervisors benefit from your success. They want to encourage it. So even if they're being selfish, they still want you to succeed. And in general, I think a lot of supervisors aren't selfish. They just want you to do well. However, it's important to keep in mind the second point, that supervisors are submerged in that overworking culture of academia, this culture that dismissed mental health and wellness as a priority, and they've succeeded. They've succeeded in receiving a job where they supervise students. And so their perception of what it takes to succeed in academia is likely biased towards this, working nonstop, working without boundaries, and they might expect or encourage their students to do the same. So this last point here is that there is a power imbalance in this relationship. The supervisor has the ability to affect your progress and your standing as a student in academia. And this dynamic is what leaves students feeling limited in their ability to challenge the academic culture with their supervisor. And I know I'm using the term supervisor, but there's a variety of terms people use. Principal investigator, PI is also common, so you can insert whatever makes sense in your field. All right. So how are we going to get this great work-life balance and good supervisory relationship? Sounds like a tall order. But so a buzzword, or a big buzzword that you kind of hear, is this idea of self-care. But so in general, self-care can be thought of as actions an individual takes to promote their own physical, mental, and spiritual health. But what those actions are may look very different from person to person. But so community care is kind of another aspect, on the other hand, is actions taken to support the collective or community. So for example, a community engaging in their mental health knowledge or their mental health literacy, so that people in the community can learn how to support one another. And of course, this is not mutually exclusive from self-care. We have to take care of ourselves before we can take care of others. But so today's topic, I'd like to think, falls in the interaction between these two spaces, self-advocacy. And so think of self-advocacy as gaining the skills yourself to ask your community for the things you personally need. So giving the people who want to support you the information they need in order to best do that. I see a heart there in the audience. That's great. But so let's think about communication. We're talking about communication here. And I want you to think about communicating things we want or that we need as being on a spectrum. So on one end, there's being passive, and on the other end, there's being aggressive. But so what is passive communication and what is aggressive communication? So there's lots of possible answers here and different ways we can define it. But for today, let's say that passive is not expressing ourselves honestly, and therefore allowing other people to violate our rights. This can also look like us expressing our thoughts in an apologetic or a tentative way. So being like, oh, I'm sorry, I would like this, right? Aggressive, on the other hand, is where you stand up for your personal rights. You express your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs, but in a way that's potentially inappropriate, and that it violates the rights of the other person. So potentially putting down the other person. And by rights, I mean kind of your rights to say no, your rights to take care of yourself, those kinds of things. So I'll often hear students say that they feel like communicating their needs comes off as aggressive, and therefore they end up on the other end, passive. But so I want us to think today about assertive communication. So assertive communication is a middle ground. We're communicating your needs while not disregarding the needs of the other person. And so other things you can think of in terms of needs or rights, I said the right to say no, or that you don't understand, the right to change your mind, the right to make mistakes, all of those things. Okay. But so now I want us to think about communication from the supervisor's side. So this was the student. Something that I'll hear from faculty is that they're worried about being too invasive. Right? So that asking students about how they're doing is not their place. And this comes up a lot in many fields, but in my field for clinical psychology, and supervisors, faculty will say, well, this is not therapy. Therapy is our work and I shouldn't be doing therapy with my student. And that's true. But so what ends up happening though, is that they end up on the other end of this continuum of being avoidant. And what we want to do with our managing upward skills is encouraging our supervisors to meet you in the middle ground, being invested. So communication is always a two-way street, and communicating in your student-supervisor relationship is no different. So our goal today is to give you the skills and approaches to have you feel confident in bringing your supervisor to that middle ground. Assertive and invested. That's our goal. All right. But so that was a bit of the introduction. I realized there was no discussion point there, but we're going to switch gears into talking about the strategies. And so these are strategies that I found particularly helpful in managing my relationship with my PhD supervisor, and also have some strategies thrown in from Dragonfly. But also, you can think of this as being useful in other situations where, as a student, you need to report up to someone, or you are trying to negotiate for your needs for your mental health. And here we'll have some discussion as well. Okay. I should also check before I keep going. Was there any questions about the first section? I'm just looking at. There is a question in the chat. If your supervisor doesn't want you to succeed or is overtly selfish in their demands, it's a sign that they're a poor supervisor. Your relationship is also poor. Okay, so more of a comment. And yeah, I think can be a real breakdown in that relationship sometimes, and it does happen. And what we hope is today is being able to bring everyone to that middle ground, being able to communicate to, now I'm reading here. Wanting to be evasive, so interesting. What are signs? So we do have a question here. I'd never thought about faculty being too invasive. What are some signs that they're feeling that way? And so I think that probably really depends on the person and kind of the style of the person of interacting. But you can maybe imagine that they're in some ways being a bit avoidant. So that other end, they're not asking you about how you're doing, or what have you been doing, or how is this going, or and I guess it depends, because at least for me in Nova Scotia, it's really common if you run into someone or if you're meeting with someone, you would ask them how they're doing. And so if they're not doing that, maybe that's a suggestion. Yeah, I like that. Stephanie mentioned there, basically avoiding personal topics. Yeah. All right, well, let's jump into the strategies here. Okay. So first, setting expectations. So ideally, supervisors would clearly set expectations with their students, given that they're in the position of power in the relationship, remember. But it's still to the student's benefit to kind of navigate these conversations if their supervisor doesn't initiate them. And there's a variety of reasons why supervisors may not initiate them. They may just have had lots of students. They're just used to the routine. Who knows? Or, it's something that they don't feel like they need, or that is clear already, whereas a new student coming in may not feel like those things are clear. But so a couple of examples here. So, what are your expectations around me replying to emails? How long would you need me to provide feedback on this? When should we meet next? What's our timeline on this project? When would you expect me to complete this next section of the manuscript or the work? All these are expectations. And so setting expectations or discussing goals around expectations should really happen every time there's a change of situation. So COVID is a great example. COVID comes, real shift in the way that everyone works and is doing, and that would affect how graduate school is going, right? But so this is easier said than done. And I start with this one because really all of the subsequent strategies we'll talk about today can be used to kind of navigate these conversations around expectations. But we can know that this is kind of our goal. You can also think of setting expectations as, just trying to be on the same page. Also, I realize there's something across my face. It's just sunlight for anyone who's confused or thinks their computer is broken. All right, but so this second one here, establish and maintain boundaries. So it's quite likely, quite possible that your supervisor is a busy person. And as a supervisor, they're also likely subjected to those pressures to produce research quickly. And like I'd said before, they're used to that overworking culture of academia in terms of achieving their goals. So it therefore may kind of fall on you as a graduate student to set your own boundaries regarding your time. And the discussion around setting boundaries may not always be explicit. You may not start off by saying, these are my boundaries. That's likely not the way it will go. But so, for example, if you think of, for me, I, trying not to work on weekends. So I might say, I won't be able to complete that by the weekend, but I should have it for you on Tuesday or Wednesday, right? So there I haven't said, I don't work on weekends, that's my boundary, but instead I've kind of indirectly said that once I've reached the weekend, I won't be able to work on it and I'll continue next week, right? Something else here is to kind of assume that your supervisor doesn't know what else is on your plate. And this can be something that we kind of forget, especially if you're in a program with, courses going on as well, or you have TA-ships. So there's a number of things you're juggling beside just your work with your supervisor. So for example, a deadline is coming up and they're asking you to do something, but they don't know that you have these other deadlines for your courses, for your TA-ship. So being able to bring those up. The other piece here is about consistency, and really having consistency between your actions and your words is really key. So an example that I like to give is around emails. So for example, I try not to answer my emails in the evenings, or I say that I don't want to answer emails in the evenings, but sometimes I do. Of course, sometimes I answer my emails in the evenings, but I want to make sure that my actions, what my supervisor receives on the other end, is consistent with what I told them. And so for me, I've on Gmail, you can have the send later option. And I'm sure there's many email servers that allow this. So even though I'm answering my email at night, I set it to send at 8 a.m. the next morning. So then it's that consistency between what I've said and what my supervisor sees. The last thing to kind of think about here, or kind of something that can be useful, is that if you're new to setting boundaries, you can provide an explanation. And so what I mean here is if you think of the example of not working on the weekend. So you're saying, oh, I won't be able to complete that for you by the weekend. I'll have it to you for Tuesday. It feels a little softer if you give it an example, or give a reasoning. So I won't be able to have it to you by the weekend. I have some family up visiting and I haven't seen them in a while, but I should have it to you by Tuesday. But so you can see there how that may feel easier, right? Like you're being less assertive, remember tentative. But something to keep in mind here is that this actually undermines your boundary a little bit. What you're saying by giving an explanation, or what you're indirectly saying, is that this isn't the usual thing. It's not normally the case that I don't work on weekends. This weekend is special, right? So it's less about kind of setting that consistent boundary and more about an exception to the rule. but it can be a great way to start, especially if you're nervous or feeling tentative. All right. But so last one of these before we stop for discussion. I know I've been talking for a while. But so I want you to take a minute and ask yourself, how many times has a task taken longer than you originally estimated? And for me, it feels like all the tasks, everything always takes longer than I think it's going to. But so when we underestimate the length of a task, and we actually end up working longer hours to meet that deadline, right? So instead, overestimate how long it'll take you to do a task. And so I know personally, I'm really terrible at being overly optimistic at how quickly I can get something done. And sometimes I'm right, sometimes, but often I'm wrong. And so definitely keep that optimism yourself. But when you're communicating your timelines to others, be a bit more conservative. If you end up finishing before the deadline, amazing. People love if you finish things before the deadline. But giving yourself a buffer also gives you room for other things to come up. So maybe it's something you enjoy, a friend reaches out to you, they want to meet up, something comes up, you're feeling sick, you didn't sleep well, your family needs you, something, right? And so hopefully you can kind of see how managing expectations in this way with your supervisor is really to support your well-being. And I didn't give an example here, but you can think of overestimating timelines as you get sent something from your supervisor, or you're working on a poster together, or you're working on a manuscript together. And instead of saying, great, I'll have that to you by Friday, you say, great, I'll have it to you by next week or by next Wednesday. And if you have it to them by Friday, like you originally thought, great, they're going to be happy to see it by Friday. But if you don't get it done by then, you still have till next week to keep going. All right. So I've been talking a lot. So we're going to pause here. I'm going to launch another poll, and then we're going to chat. All right. So I want to know, has your supervisor ever initiated an explicit conversation around expectations for you working with them? Great. Okay, I'll end poll here. We'll share results. And poll, share results. Okay. So has your supervisor ever initiated an explicit conversation around expectations? 30% said yes, 70% said no. So I'm glad to see the 30%. That's great. But we can see that for most people, that's not the norm. How comfortable are you setting expectations? You see a mix here, some very comfortable and comfortable, a lot of people neutral or slightly uncomfortable, and setting and maintaining boundaries. So we have a bimodal split here, either slightly uncomfortable or comfortable. Great. Okay. So I'm wondering at kind of this discussion point, if people could jump in, why or why not have you felt comfortable about setting expectations or boundaries with your supervisor? I thank you everyone for the discussion. I think we could probably spend the whole time right here, but we will keep going. And those who have their hands raised, I think there was at least one more. Jump in 2 slides from now. We've got more discussion points. All right. So more strategies here. And this is honestly one of my favorites because it feels like such a concrete thing. So using the yes, but methods. So we're often told to just say no to more work and responsibility, but that is way easier said than done, especially when there's a power imbalance, right? Saying no to your supervisor seems daunting, or like we mentioned earlier, maybe there's that culture that the supervisor, their needs matter, right? So it's difficult. But so something that we can do is trying the yes but method instead. So this allows students to not take on any more work than they have time for, hopefully, but makes it a bit harder for the supervisor to say no. So for example, Yes. So for example, you can imagine that that you're working on a paper or a presentation, and the supervisor brings up something else that they'd like the student to do. I just saw this abstract posting that's come out that would be great for your research. Let's do it. Let's fill it out this week. But you know that you also have this poster presentation you're working on for the week or something like that. So the way the yes but method would work is that you respond to your supervisor saying, wow, yeah, that paper sounds right up my alley. You're right. It's such a good fit for my research. But I do have that presentation that I've been working on already, and they're both due around the same time. You know, which one would you prefer I work on? Or do you think we'd have to drop the presentation in order to do this, right? And you can imagine that you might have to offer to drop something, right? And something that I will suggest to people or they can consider is offering to drop the item that's less important to your supervisor. Makes it more appealing. You know, if they're really on this paper, they really want this paper, you can offer to drop the presentation. But you can also think about that offering to drop an item is difficult because it's also setting a boundary with yourself. You know, it's often the case that lots of things that come up are really great opportunities, and it's a matter of us not taking on all of them. So it can be hard for us to say, okay, well, I'm not going to do this and do this instead, or vice versa. Yeah, but so you can imagine this yes but method. So I have another poll for you, a short one. It says, have you ever said yes to a request from your supervisor when you wanted to or should have said no? So perhaps unsurprisingly, most people here said yes. But so, and you're not alone. But so my question for you maybe at this point is, what got in the way of saying no? What made it difficult? And, you know, for me, it's often been, you know, that academic culture, perhaps this idea that, oh, I see other people publishing lots and also doing well here. And, you know, if they can do it, I can do it. Or this thought that I can't say no, you know, it's my supervisor. They told me they want me to do it. I guess I got to do it, right? But so please do jump in. What got in the way of saying no? Or has anyone used the yes but method before? How'd that go? But all right, let's keep going here. We're doing good on time in that I was hoping to be an hour in once we've gone through all the strategies. So I think we're on track. We're doing good. Thanks for everyone for sticking with us so far. All right, so next piece here. So keeping your supervisor accountable. So I want you to imagine that you've just navigating a meeting with your supervisor using all your managing upward skills. You were uncomfortable, but you were assertive, and you left really happy knowing that you agreed on reasonable timelines and expectations. All right, this beautiful meeting has just happened. But supervisors often have, you know, maybe labs, they have many students, they have lots to juggle. So summarizing your key points via email, both your commitments and theirs, can be very helpful. So example number one here was, thanks for meeting today. Just to summarize what we discussed, you know, I'll have my conference poster draft to you by this date. You agreed to give me feedback by this date. We agreed to writing a manuscript at the moment. It's not feasible with my current course load this term, and we'll revisit it next term. But something that can be kind of useful about this is that it does make it easier to follow up. So for example, if they haven't given you feedback, you can follow up within timeline. Or if a supervisor comes to you and says, oh, what about that manuscript? You know, where is it? Likely because they've forgotten about your conversation if they have lots of students, right? It makes it a bit easier to be assertive about the decisions made in the meeting. So in this example, supervisor, hi student, we should meet to discuss the manuscript outline for your current projects. Student, hi supervisor, unfortunately I'll not be able to start the manuscript this term. We'd agreed that I'd revisit the topic next term. See the forwarded email below from the summary of our last meeting. And so this is a strategy that you can talk about with your supervisor directly. If they have a lot on their plate, some might appreciate kind of that extra structure, that extra organization on your end. It makes it so there's less for them to worry about. They don't have to worry that they're dropping the ball or that they've missed something or what is it that we talked about. But there might be a variation that works for you both. So for example, with me and my supervisor, we had an ongoing Google document where I kept track of kind of our meeting minutes instead of sending them emails. And this worked well because they didn't have many students. They didn't need an email summary each time. They could kind of keep track of where we were at because it was just a few of us. And if there was any ever questions or we were wondering about what we agreed on, or if I was concerned about what we agreed on, I could open up this document, but I didn't need to send them an email every time. They got too many emails and they didn't want the emails anyway, I'm sure. But so you can imagine this can be a discussion with your supervisor. And it can be viewed too as being or taking initiative. You know, if you can imagine a meeting with your supervisor and kind of offered to take on this extra organizational piece, which is actually to your benefit, I'm sure they would be happy or be impressed or have another suggestion for what would work well for you guys. But something else to keep in mind here is coming in with an agenda. So this, if you think of here, I've kind of talked about emailing after your meeting. You can also think about talking with your supervisor if you think it's a good fit about emailing before the meeting. So is emailing about what you're going to cover. And this can work well for both overbearing and really passive supervisors if your supervisor happens to fall on either of those ends. So if you have someone who is trying to get you to do a lot and it's kind of difficult to keep them on track with the things that you're trying to work on at the moment, setting an agenda really narrows that in, right? It's like, these are the things that I need to work on. If it's a passive supervisor, it's difficult to pull their feedback, to get their input. Kind of sending them this in advance and sticking to it can help be a structure to the conversation. Make sure you get feedback on all the things you're looking for. But so I've got one more strategy point that I want to just highlight. And this is kind of just a general thought. And I think it fits with something that we were talking about earlier. So anticipate and communicate issues. And so I think there's this misconception, and we have talked about this a bit, that reaching out to change a deadline or a plan is perceived really poorly. And maybe that's the case in some places that you've been told that that's been met poorly. But I think there's a lot of times where the reality is that it feels uncomfortable, but it actually shows strong organizational and problem-solving skills. Another way to think about it too is that it shows respect for your supervisor's time. So for example, if you had said that you were going to have a draft in by, the end of the week, and it's now Tuesday, and you know that it's just not going to happen, emailing them to let them know that that's not you're not on track to meet that, and that actually, next Friday is more reasonable, does show respect for their time. And I think a better scenario would be even that you anticipate issues way in advance. So I know for me in graduate school, we would meet with our supervisors in the first couple of weeks, but then you would also, we had to take a lot of courses for psychology. And so in addition to your research, so you would then get your syllabi for courses and you'd get your deadlines for when things are due. And so suddenly the deadlines that I might have discussed with my supervisor don't seem reasonable. It's only been a week since we talked about them and decided about them, but I'm already realizing that they aren't. They're going to be really difficult to meet. because of this new information I've gathered. So reaching out to them then and talking about anticipating this issue and communicating before we kind of really practice. Something that I'd like us to do is a little exercise that you'll just do at home right now. And I want you to put it in writing. So if you think of, you're trying to communicate with your supervisor, your boundaries, your expectations, what's important to you, but it's important to kind of know what those are for you. And I'd imagine a lot of people know already, but it's useful to kind of explicitly think about it. So I want you just now to you can jot down on your computer, you can jot down on your phone, you can sit and think about it just for a minute, write down at least 3 boundaries for yourself. And to give you an example, I'll show you some of mine. So my example is not sending emails in the evenings or weekends. But like I said, I do still use the Boomerang extension or the Gmail send later extension so that I can answer in the email evenings, but it doesn't send to the morning. My second one is not including my weekends in my available work time. And you've noticed kind of the way I've written it doesn't say never work on weekends, because that's also, that feels hard as a grad student, at least it did to me. Sometimes there was things I wanted to get done on the weekends, but when I'm budgeting out how long something is going to take me, I don't include the weekend. If it ends up falling over into the weekend, that's a different story. And my last one is taking a lunch break, some kind of lunch break. Maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe I get a whole hour in, but something. But so once people have written down a couple of these or thought about them, if you feel comfortable putting one of them in the chat, I'd love to see what people come up with. If you don't feel comfortable, that's also all right. I'll give everyone a minute. While people are still putting in boundaries if they feel comfortable, something that I like to bring up kind of at this point too is this idea, because you've probably heard of before, work-life balance, right? We've talked about it already today. And often I think we think of work-life balance as being this, or the goal that we're trying to achieve is this perfect balance. You can imagine, like, work, life, just perfectly balanced. Wouldn't that be nice? But I think something that someone had told me once that I really took to heart was this idea of work-life balance being more like a seesaw or a teeter-totter, or I don't know if that's just a very Nova Scotian term, but a teeter-totter is one of those things that kids sit on, one on each side, and it goes back and forth like this. So this idea that it's not always a perfect balance, that sometimes it's more work, sometimes it's more life. And it's really about this idea of kind of equaling out overall, that over time you get a balance of the two. And so I really appreciate that. Sometimes if I miss my lunch break, but I know that last week I got a lunch break every day for, I don't know, 30 minutes, then maybe I don't feel so bad, right? Because it's that teeter-totter. All right. And I love this. We see a couple other self-care days, familial duties. Awesome. I'm glad you're all thinking about this. Okay, so our next piece is our role plays. But so what we're going to do in this section is I have 3 scenarios for you, or 3 prompts. And for each prompt, what we're going to do is that we'll go into a breakout rooms. I'll assign you for 2 people for a room. And I want you to each try each role. So imagine yourself being the supervisor, and then imagine yourself being the student. We're gonna start off with 8 minutes and see how that goes. So 4 minutes for each role, and I'll give you a signal when it's been 4 minutes and it's time to switch. And then we're gonna come back together and we're gonna discuss as a group. We're gonna talk about how that went. Did it feel uncomfortable? Did it feel really easy? Is it something you've done before? And it says use your cheat sheet if you forget the strategies. That was the document you downloaded, but I will also type it into the chat. It's just a list of the 6 strategies in case you're forgetting. Okay, so I'll read you our first role play and then we'll break you off. So our first one is, you are having the first meeting with your supervisor since attending the Managing Upward workshop. You have decided to apply the strategies you've learned by starting a conversation about expectations and timelines. And remember, a great way to start a discussion is to be curious. So ask questions. So what I mean by that one is, if you imagine yourself in your first meeting, a great way to open up to a topic that you're wondering about is to ask a question about it. It's a very non-threatening way to introduce topics. So if I'm interested in knowing about emails, I might just ask, nice to meet you. We're talking about our work. Just wondering about emails. Are you someone that replies to emails in the evenings or on weekends? What are your expectations for your students? Or for me as a new student, or what should I expect as a new student, right? Very non-threatening. Okay, so we're gonna break you off. If you weren't able to download the document, feel free to take a picture or a screenshot of this scenario too, and you can adapt the scenario how you'd like. Okay, but so I guess just in closing, so something that you can think about is that the strategies we've talked about today can really be summarized as both being assertive and communicating both clearly and often. And we really broke that down a lot today. But given that being assertive is really difficult in a relationship where there's a power imbalance, it's important to know, why are you trying to be assertive and what are you trying to achieve? And something that I like to think about and show to fellow graduate students is this idea that, being a graduate student is actually just one part of your life. And so what makes you outside of being a graduate student? And it can be kind of a fun question to think about. But so when you're saying no to work and when you're other work and when you're setting boundaries, when you're overestimating those timelines, you know that you're doing it to protect your mental health and also to make space for all these other things that are important and meaningful to you. And I think kind of knowing what those other aspects are can be kind of a buffer against sometimes that negative work-life culture of academia. So, if a graduate student is doing poorly or their work is going poorly and it feels like that's the only thing going on in their life or the most important thing, then those setbacks are going to feel a lot worse than if you're looking at your graduate student work as only a piece of who you are. But so a closing thought. But so I do have a poll that's the same questions we asked at the beginning. And I'm going to throw it out to you all now, and then we are wrapped up for the day. Awesome. Well, that's fun. There's a little bit of a shift here. You can see people who've made it all the way to the end today are definitely aware of some skills and approaches, how confident they feel. Some more confident, some still neutral. That's fair. It maybe takes some time. It's also hard without having put any of this into practice. But I just want to thank you all for coming today. Something that I'll highlight to folks, especially in the aspect of kind of different cultures, if you think about it, is finding a mentor can be really useful if you're from a particular culture or a particular background, and finding someone else who is really in that as well and would understand your viewpoint or your situation more perfectly. That can be really helpful. The other thing that I'll bring up to people is that, today's workshop was based on a blog post originally, a long time before it developed into this workshop today, a blog post for Voices of Academia, which I highly recommend. It's a website where academics share their mental health journeys. It's really a fabulous read that's updated all the time. And that's all.